Thank you for spending some of your Sunday to listen to me rant. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Jarrad. I'm the director of the Institute of Free Technology. I'm a co-founder of Status, which was big in 2017, and more recently co-founder of Logos, which is an upcoming project. And I'm here today to talk about how to pirate a $60 trillion institution. So show of hands, who's heard of Project Goldfish? Okay, there's a couple, that's great. So Project Goldfish was basically a pseudo-report or a paper that was done by Adrian Norman, who is a little-known person, but who is a co-writer on the book called The Computerized Society, which was incredibly influential back in the time. This paper came out in 1978, right? That's like 50 years ago or half a century today. And in it, he described a data haven. More specifically, he described something that we're trying to effectively build, a computerized network that was entirely anonymous and effectively operated like a tax haven, but did so in the net, right? Of course, he had ideas of technology as it was back then, but it would take like an extra decade or so for the cypherpunks or for the crypto-anarchists or the extropians to really even try and pick up this idea. And it would take even a further decade with the music industry going after music piracy and the advent of or rise of peer-to-peer file sharing technologies before we could really understand that we could build distributed systems that would actually implement something like Project Goldfish. In the book, The Pirate Organization by Durand, he would have called the systems that we're creating a meta-sovereign, right? It's like this system, a distributed system that uses regulatory arbitrage or jurisdictional arbitrage to maintain its integrity, just like Bitcoin, just like Ethereum, just like DarkFi or even Logos, right? But, of course, you don't need distributed systems to create meta-sovereigns. A couple of talks ago, I did a talk called Corruption, KYC, and the Cost of Compliance, where I try to offer you a different perspective on the compliance regime and KYC and AML, both in terms of proportionality and its effectiveness. So there's a QR code there if you're interested in checking it out later. But just a little taster here, the amount that we spend on compliance is actually double what they estimate goes towards global terrorism financing, which is one of the core reasons for tracing illicit financial flows. Worse than that, even though we're all doing KYC, taking a photo with our stupid face in front of with our stupid passport, less than 1% of illicit financial flows is recovered, right? It's even worse, these policies actually get implemented in countries and then are used by politicians against their political opponents to economically lock them out. So yeah, what we're really seeing here, or I want to frame this, is that we actually see two different ways of doing a meta-sovereign. You have a transnational policy network like the Financial Action Task Force or the World Economic Forum, and these are they're not even legalistic entities, right? In many cases, they don't actually exist anywhere. And at the same time, they seem to undermine the sovereignty of nation-states. Furthermore, they were never democratically elected. You never voted for these policies, yet you are forced to participate in them. Conversely, systems like Project Goldfish or distributed systems that we're trying to create, they're actually completely open. You can participate in consensus or in the development of the protocols. You expressly consent when you sign a transaction with them, which is a huge property, right? Even with a nation state, you have an implied consent, right? Just by virtue of you being born in a region makes you a citizen, and therefore you're subject to these laws, right? So these two sort of worldviews of these meta-sovereigns have very different understandings of what a tax haven is and how they utilize this concept, right? One is trying to effectively suppress it, and the other one actually sees it very integral, right? So are tax havens good? Are they bad? Who knows? To answer that, we're going to kind of go through what, say, the whole compliance regime of the past, quarter century has been arguing, and see how effective they've been. This has been left out of the previous talk, so I'm kind of building on it. Here is just a straight line of basically the 10% of global offshore household wealth staying the same despite like 5 or 6 different policies being applied to the entire planet. Little explicit foreshadowing, I don't know, for sunlighting. Our story takes us back to basically the 80s. No, like 80s and 90s, the world was becoming more and more globalized, right? And there was a huge anxiety about this because capital was starting to move much more faster and dramatically around the planet. In fact, Project Goldfish was a paper that came out kind of spurring some of this debate, right? So it wasn't trying to cause anxiety, but like it was offering something tangible, concrete, in which you could be anxious about. But this really this culminated in this report called Harmful Tax Competition by the OECD, which was in 1998, I believe. And this really started framing the whole idea around tax havens, right? Like this notion of harmful became like embedded, and you probably have that in your own understanding today. And within like 2 years, 35 jurisdictions around the planet were blacklisted from the global economy. Fast forward 1 year, the States had its big boom, the 2 towers were hit, and this is when things got really ramped up, right? Basically, within like a month of the Twin Towers being hit, the US up-signaled the Financial Action Task Force policies and deployed them around the entire planet. Again, this is trying to track down this global terrorism financing. I won't go into this too much because this is in the previous talk on this topic. But yeah, this was like the time where like all these banks were like forced to change and forced to comply, and consequently why you comply today. Fast forward to 2008. Never let a good crisis go to waste. We had the financial crisis. And in the year after, the G20 got together in London, where Gordon Brown basically proclaimed that the era of bank secrecy is over, right? At this point, the OECD blacklisted another 45 territories. Havens were effectively given an ultimatum where they had to sign at least 12 information exchange treaties. And within just 5 days, every haven had effectively committed to this. By the end of 2009, there were about 300 of these treaties that were actually signed. There's a quote here that I didn't put on the screen, which is, the G20 threatened to impose economic sanctions on non-compliant havens. In just 5 days, all havens committed to signing 12 treaties, and the G20 declared the era of bank secrecy over, from Johansson and Zuckman. Anyway, I said that already. Okay, fast forward, basically another year. Right? So this is actually happening pretty quickly. The US implemented FATCA, where it required every nation state to report on their own citizens to the IRS, regardless of where they were on the planet. Fast forward a few more years, we actually had the largest transparency initiative on the entire planet. This was the establishment of the Common Reporting System. This is where over 100 plus countries committed to automatic exchange of all financial account information. And that actually started beginning in 2017. I don't know if you can see the map there, but the red is where the CRS is implemented. And most particularly, I want to point out the United States. Notice how it's gray? You know why that is? It's because they exempted themselves from the reciprocal information exchange. Interesting. So that wasn't enough, right? One of the anxieties I forgot to mention was in globalization was that the concern was effectively that as this wealth moved around the planet, it meant that that was leaving the host country, the onshore country, and therefore the fear was that their tax base would be diminished, right? And then if you can't, get tax or revenue as a government, then you can't provide governing services. So it's a pretty reasonable argument or concern. So a lot of this was effectively to eliminate secrecy entirely and be able to repatriate that money, right? Around sort of 2013, the OECD and G20 also implemented the BEPS action plan, which is basically now targeting not the actual jurisdictions, but multinationals themselves, right? They basically wanted to tax multinational countries at the global level. And for US companies in particular, there's also the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which tried to effectively add some anti-profit shifting, as they call it, provisions, right? So you want to move your capital where it's going to be respected the most, right? And that gives you the less tax out of it, right? Or coerced theft, if you're a libertarian. Great. So very nice, great success, mission accomplished, right? In 2024, the EU Tax Observatory found that from all of these policies, we had roughly a 3 times decline in untaxed offshore wealth. Sounds like we did a good job, right? We removed secrecy from the planet in terms of finance. We now have total surveillance over the global financial system. But there's a couple of issues with everything that happened over the past 25 years. In a 2008 report from the International Monetary Fund on offshore financial centers, tax havens, they found that compliance levels for offshore financial centers were comparable with those of onshore jurisdictions, right? So they actually weren't that much different than any other country that you're in terms of complying with the requests that were made from them. And this was before the implementation of the Common Reporting Standard. We now know in hindsight, even from 2019, 4 years into the implementation of the BEPS process, so this is the going after the multinational revenues and profits, we actually know that there's actually no discernible decline in their behavior, right? They haven't actually changed what they were doing. They're still doing it. Interesting. I find it interesting. Where are we? So there were these hopes that doing all of this would repatriate the funds, right? If there was no actual benefit ever keeping your money offshore, then surely you would want to keep the revenue in your onshore country, right? Even if you're being taxed on it. It turns out that even with all of this in place, the multinational companies did it anyway. It did not trigger a significant repatriation of funds, and ultimately the total amount of wealth that's managed offshore remains the same, right? It's kind of similar to that 10% that I showed you on that graph. Curious, then, if you remember the map with the US, on the, what was this? There's this financial secrecy index, which kind of maps where secrecy exists, how secret your finances are in these different jurisdictions. It turns out the United States is number 1 now, right? And so you could be forgiven to think that maybe what has been happening over the past 25 years has started off with some legitimate concerns, but now had turned into a means of foreign policy in which you can strengthen the utility of the US dollar, right? And you can eliminate this element or this property from other jurisdictions but consolidate it in your own, which then strengthens your economy because capital goes where it's respected. This becomes a little bit more clear in more recent years where the United Nations has actually tried to hold a tax convention to reclaim or take over the governance of how this actually works, right? In 2023, 110 of these countries voted in favor for doing this and taking it away from the OECD. 8 of them were against. Against is kind of not really the right word. They were non-participatory, right? That matters because these 8 countries and their dependent territories are actually the people who own these jurisdictions. They are home to 8% of the world's people, yet they're collectively responsible for over 1/3 of global tax losses. That might not mean, it might not sound like too much, but is it here? Yeah. When it comes to actually understanding how this impacts countries, it's pretty dramatic. Because these tax losses disproportionately impact developing countries. Just on public health, low-income health budgets for the states gets dropped by like nearly 40%, right, 36%. Whereas like high-income countries don't really have this particular issue in the same way. It's only 7%. And these higher income countries are responsible for 99% of all cross-border tax abuse. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Bit of a time. Okay. So here, there's a quote from a paper stating that the increasing transparency and exchange of information does not seem to have had a dramatic effect on the amount of household wealth held offshore, indicating that tax evasion cannot be the primary motive for holding financial assets offshore today. So, wait. Why doesn't the capital get repatriated then after implementing all of these things? And if secrecy isn't what draws capital offshore, then what does? Well, to answer that question, it's useful to understand how like the World Bank and these development finance investment banks who co-fund development projects in developing countries actually act and use these offshore financial centers. Very often, they do not feel comfortable putting their assets or any of the contracts within the legal systems of these developing countries. And the reason for that is because their institutional quality is incredibly poor, right? You wouldn't want, let's say that you had like millions of dollars and you did want to stash it somewhere, right? Like you're not going to put it into a country that might have like an authoritarian regime with a corrupt dictator. You might expect, I don't think you'd feel very safe putting your money in like that kind of bank. It might just disappear overnight. If you're a Simpsons fan, you know, Mr. Byrne tries to gives $1 trillion bill to the president of Cuba and then doesn't get it back. And so what the World Bank does is they actually find the closest offshore financial center to the region that they're operating in and uses their services. And it's because they have much higher degree of trust and much higher degree of institutional quality. In fact, there are almost no poorly governed tax havens. You know, think Switzerland, for example. And it's no wonder that this is the case, right? Like, these islands, these exotic places you like to go, they have no agriculture, they have no like resources, like natural resources. They have very little exports and a lot of imports. So almost in like a Darwinian-like fashion, these states have tried to like, leverage their sovereignty and leverage their place in the global economy to effectively build out better institutions, because it can operate in this sort of like virtual space in governance, right? And like, I mean, the proof is in the pudding in terms of this strategy. Like, major tax havens have less than 1% of the world's population, yet they account for like 2.3% of global GDP. They host 5.7% of foreign employment and 8% of foreign property. Their GDP per capita growth is like nearly double any onshore country. The global economy actually runs in these places, right? At almost 60 trillion, their external positions are now 20 times larger than their combined GDP, which accounts for just 2.8% of global economic activity. I mean, it's not really just, that's huge for these islands. In fact, in the Cayman Islands, they are the largest foreign holder of US Treasury securities, right? More than pretty much anywhere else. So, one way to think about this, why this sort of like, why money or wealth goes offshore is actually treating it more like a signal, right? It's a signal that the institutional quality of the onshore country is a little bit poor, right? Take, for example, Argentina, right? Like, they have many unstable financial institutions. Crypto is incredibly attractive to a lot of Argentinians because it can offer, even though it's so volatile, it's still actually offering something more stable than what you can actually get locally. Is that really a crime, or is that just like rational thinking, right? Like, if you're trying to save money for your time? Okay. All right, so it says 3 minutes here, but it's okay. Yeah. So it's not just like Argentina or developing countries either, right? Like, institutional failure is becoming global. According to a Gallup study in 2025, trust in government is at a 5-decade low of 28%. And if you talk to the Congressional Budget Office or the Government Accountability Office, or even the Treasury, there is massive concerns around government debts and sovereign debts, right? We're now hitting a debt. Next year, the US will hit a debt record that has been unprecedented since World War II. And the IMF and the OECD countries see a similar thing, where most countries are going to be at 100% of their GDP, right? So the interest payments are going to put us into a debt spiral in the next sort of 20 years, 10, 20 years. So one thing that's interesting about these offshore financial centers is, like, these are quality institutions, but really they're only for the rich, right? Like, if you're an average person, you can't really get access to them in the same way. But there is a tremendous amount of capital in these developing countries that, if they had access to stable institutions such as like property registries, then there's actually a tremendous amount of wealth that could be unlocked. You know, this is a Hernando de Soto quote here. In 2020, he believes that $9.3 trillion is actually locked in these countries. Adjusted for inflation, that's about 17 trillion. And over 1.1 billion people on the planet actually feel insecure about their property rights. So if we can go over the wires with our technology and bring this institutional quality to them, we should be able to unlock a tremendous amount of value. Here's another argument that's basically saying that if you can reduce a transaction cost in the abstract sense in a country by 0.1%, you enable that country to be able to effectively quadruple its wealth, which is effectively the difference between Argentina and Switzerland, right? So you don't need to have a tremendous impact in total societal change. You only need that 0.1%, right? Not 1%, 0.1. This is where I'm going to pivot a little bit, but basically, the US government went after Switzerland to get rid of its very strong bank secrecy laws by effectively targeting its 4,700 different people. These were like, you know, bankers, lawyers, accounts of people, and so on, right? They identified the operators that were facilitating this institution and exposed them, and then tried to persecute them in some sense. My point here is this is actually not that different to what happened to Ethereum and subsequently Bitcoin around Tornado Cash and OFAC sanctions, right? Even though people weren't, like, apart from Tornado Cash, the validators and block relayers, I'm out of time, and get the point, right? It's effectively a similar property. What they're actually doing is they're destroying a property of quality of institutions called credible commitments, right? There's this two ways to think about this. There's the motivational one, the things that you promise and whether you uphold those promises, and the imperative credibility, which is like things that you can put into code or into the structures that can't fundamentally change anything. So yeah, basically blockchains are not reliable enough, blockchains are not enough to ensure reliable service delivery of quality institutions as they are today. And I want you to think about privacy as creating strong, credible commitments, particularly imperative commitments. If we make our systems unidentifiable in terms of their operators and how they actually function, then they can actually deliver quality institutions to those in need. I know I'll stop there, but there's a book, there's social stuff. Thank you very much.